clothes, all right? You look nice in suits. I don't see you in suits. Thank you guys, all of you, for coming out today. I'm going to start out. In 2011, South Sudan voted overwhelmingly for independence from the government of Sudan, and its president, Omar al-Bashir, a man who was charged with war crimes by the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, in the past 5 years, South Sudan's leaders have engaged in much of the same behavior, including mass atrocities on its citizens, starvation, and rape, all while plundering the state's resources and enriching themselves and their families. So this press conference today is a culmination of a 2-year undercover investigation by the Sentry using forensic accountants and experts formerly from the FBI and the Treasury Department, along with many, many others. Okay, so here we go. This morning, we're prepared to give evidence of massive criminal behavior by the president of South Sudan and by his opposition, the ousted vice president of South Sudan, and their generals. The simple fact is, they're stealing the money to fund their militias to attack and kill one another. The evidence is thorough, it is detailed, and it is irrefutable. It involves arms dealers, international lawyers, international banks, international real estate, and it is because of these international actors that we are also able to provide solutions to help end this criminal behavior to protect innocent civilians. Since 2014, the U.S. has given $1.5 billion in aid to South Sudan. The United States and the world recognizes that South Sudan cannot become a failed state, not simply because of the humanitarian crisis, but also because we have seen the influences that can take hold in a failed state. We can either take action now or we can spend the next decade mopping up the mess. At this press conference, we'll be giving you bullet points, but you all have received a much more detailed portfolio that I hope that you will read, and I hope that you will report on it. And for those watching in South Sudan, we hope that you will investigate what we are giving you, and we hope that you will report on that. We feel confident. I want to turn this over to John Prendergast to introduce our Sentry team, and he's going to moderate part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, George. War has been hell for South Sudan's people, but it has been very lucrative for the country's leaders and their commercial collaborators in the international financial system. And that's why we formed the Sentries, which is a partnership between 3 organizations, not on our watch, which Don Cheadle and George and I are board members of, the Enough Project and the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. As we begin, all of us want to say a special thank you to Mary Beth Goodman, who helped us build this organization, the Sentry, before going back to her position at the National Security Council. Mary Beth, if you're watching, we will all wish you a very speedy recovery.
Get well, Mary Beth.
There are few people in the world who have suffered as much during the past half-century as the South Sudanese, who have suffered through 3 major wars and watched their leaders and international enablers profit from their misery. So before we dive into the heart of our presentation and the report's findings, we wanted to first share with everyone a video produced by the Sentry that provides context and an overview of what we're here to talk about today.
Tens of thousands of innocent people killed, entire cities destroyed, nearly 2.5 million people driven from their homes. South Sudan, the world's newest nation, is being torn apart by a horrific civil war fueled by massive corruption. 2 men, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar, command forces responsible for mass rape, child soldier recruitment, and massacres of civilians. Top officials in South Sudan have built personal fortunes while their country suffers. They've hijacked the state, looting natural resources, robbing state coffers, killing anyone who gets in their way. Government money is diverted to lethal private militias and weapons used against the people. To try to stop this corruption-fueled violence, we formed the Sentry to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle the networks benefiting from the violence in East and Central Africa, the deadliest war zone in the world. Even the president of South Sudan has called corruption in his own government the cause of this war.
Some of these ministers have bought apartments, they have bought very beautiful houses, villas. They are hiding it in Kenya.
You know this.
And they have refused to reveal.
Beautiful houses, hidden wealth, he should know. President Kiir's official salary is $60,000 a year, but among the Kiir family getaways is this elegant villa in Lavington, an upscale community in Nairobi, Kenya. The president's family has lived in luxury outside the country. They post videos partying in five-star hotels, driving expensive cars, and jet-setting around the world, while average South Sudanese are living through hell.
How did they take this money there to buy?
Good question. Sentry investigators found the president's closest inner circle, his wife, children, several powerful in-laws, are part owners of oil companies, mining firms, banks, casinos, and an airline. They left a trail of insider deals, corrupt contracts, and outright fraud. One company, owned by the president's in-laws, stole millions of dollars that were supposed to buy food for hungry citizens. They're also in a murky venture with a major multinational oil company, Petronas. One of the in-laws in that oil partnership, the president's brother-in-law, is a major general in the army. In the ongoing battle over power, President Kiir has stoked the conflict by twice firing Vice President Machar. Yet Machar is no innocent victim. He's been playing the same dirty financial game. Machar tried to sell off the country's oil to a Russian arms dealer in return for deadly weapons, while his family lives in different homes outside South Sudan, far from the war zone. And now his family stays here, in Lavington, in the same neighborhood as President Kiir. Our Sentry investigators found evidence of international complicity at every turn. These officials could not continue to loot and kill without the help of an array of international facilitators, not just secretive Russian arms dealers, but also international bankers, businessmen, and lawyers. These war profiteers are stealing from some of the poorest people in the world.
I have written even to President Obama to tell him that they helped me to recover this money.
That's right, President Kiir. Governments around the world should begin freezing and seizing these stolen assets, starting with yours. Sentry investigators are turning over dossiers of evidence of grand corruption in South Sudan to governments around the world. These same governments have crafted financial tools to combat terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and organized crime. Now it's time to use these tools to stop these men from looting and killing in South Sudan. We've long suspected these crimes were taking place, and now we have the proof. We have the moral obligation and the power to do something about it. War crimes shouldn't pay.
Unfortunately, in South Sudan today, war crimes actually do pay. South Sudan leaders no longer take seriously the threats made by the United Nations, by the United States, and others to impose consequences for their behavior. South Sudan's leaders have learned that rape as a war weapon, child soldier recruitment, and mass killings are not enough to trigger any meaningful accountability measures. What's missing is international leverage. And so we consulted widely with banking and finance and policy experts, and we're proposing a new approach to creating immediate and we think unprecedented leverage to counter mass atrocities being committed in South Sudan. This approach would utilize these precision-guided financial policy tools, normally reserved for countering terrorism, for fighting organized crime, for halting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But this time, we want to use these tools, these policy tools, in the service of human rights and peace and good governance in South Sudan. The essence of this new strategy would combine readily available anti-money laundering measures, which we never use for this kind of purpose, And we combine those anti-money laundering measures with targeted sanctions, which would be focused on the top officials in the regime and their international facilitators. And then robustly enforcing this approach, especially focusing on the properties that they're enjoying outside of the country and their banking activities, would effectively freeze these targets out of, and their networks out of the international financial system. It would put banks and other commercial actors on notice that the same fate would befall them if they keep processing transactions or laundering money for those that are targeted. When you designate top officials, you deny them access to the banks because of the centrality of the dollar, of the United States dollar in the international financial system, and because of the importance of the American banking system and capital markets. This combination of government and private sector action could be a powerful and a unique manifestation of 21st century leverage. And it's cheaper, it's less risky, and more effective than the other policy options on the table.
Our Sentry investigators have collected evidence of how money is stolen and moved out of the country. They've poured through thousands of pages of legal records, corporate filings, financial statements, and other official correspondence. They've tracked suspects on social media and utilized satellite imagery to gather and analyze data about their assets and their movements. Investigators traveled to multiple locations, including Melbourne, Adelaide, Kampala, Juba, Cairo, and Nairobi, to gather evidence and to interview hundreds of experts and eyewitnesses, many of whom spoke under the condition of anonymity.
The Sentry has found evidence that these top officials responsible for mass atrocities in South Sudan have managed to accumulate fortunes and have been involved in murky transactions, insider deals, and outright fraud. Immediate family members of President Kiir and his wife have held interests in almost 24 companies operating in oil, mining, construction, gambling, banking, telecommunications, aviation, and government and military procurement. These families of several top officials we examined live in million-dollar mansions outside of the country. They post videos partying in hotels, driving around luxury cars, all while the rest of the people in their country suffer from the consequences of a brutal civil war, and in many places experience near-famine conditions. As the video just showed, the members of the Kiir Machar families, living in homes in the same upscale neighborhood in Nairobi. One of the top military officials in the country, General Paul Malone, makes roughly $45,000 a year as the SPLA Chief of Staff, but somehow on this salary has at least 2 luxurious villas in Uganda, in addition to a $2 million mansion in a gated community in Nairobi. And this all appears to just be the tip of the iceberg. But this isn't just a case of compare and contrast. This is cause and effect. We're not here to talk about how it's unfair that these generals and politicians have grown rich while the rest of the country suffers. We're here because those people are suffering precisely because of this greed.
And to build on what Don's saying, this is not a study of a few corrupt officials in Africa. It's not a study of corruption in South Sudan since the 2005 peace deal that ended the previous North-South war. What it is an attempt to get at the nexus of what drives violent conflict and mass atrocities in South Sudan, the connection between endemic corruption and deadly violence, and about how these networks benefit from a system that's built on corruption and uses extreme violence to keep it in place. As for the investigation itself, the Sentry focused on top officials identified by the United Nations and by the African Union as having command authority over military operations that resulted in widespread human rights crimes since December 2013. We also examined the networks that have enabled and empowered these men to loot and evade accountability. Our research and investigation will continue, but we focused in this particular phase on those responsible today and against whom action can be taken today. It is our strongly held view that as long as South Sudan's war remains profitable to its leaders, peace will be very elusive. The status quo of violent conflict is good for a certain kind of business, the illicit kind. The basic pillars of the war economy, therefore, must be addressed. And the financial supply chains that fuel conflict need to be disrupted. American and European taxpayers have contributed billions of dollars and euros for humanitarian and peacekeeping and governance assistance over the last few years, with little focus on the core driver of the devastation. Unless those links between conflict and corruption are confronted, peace will remain a distant dream for South Sudan.
It's important also to mention that our investigators found that these top officials in South Sudan could not continue to loot and kill without the help of international facilitators. Now, we're talking about international bankers, businessmen, companies, arms brokers, real estate agents, and lawyers who, knowingly or not, facilitate these activities. South Sudanese officials partner with big multinational companies, use international banks to move their money, and park their assets abroad.
We found hard evidence of foreign companies having made direct payments to the personal bank accounts of high-ranking Sudanese generals. Whether they know it or not, companies that make payments to those responsible for looting and killing in South Sudan, play a part in facilitating the violent kleptocracy. The banks that process the transactions also play a role, whether they are aware of it or not. Banks have facilitated the apparent diversion of significant sums of money that should have been used to benefit some of the poorest people in the world. And today, and through the work the Sentry will continue to do, these companies and banks can no longer say they didn't know.
So now we're going to turn to three of our Sentry investigators to take us a little deeper into the way these illicit financial flows work in South Sudan. We have Brian Adeba, right to George's right. We have J.R. Mailey to Brian's right, and Debra LaPrevotte to my left. And you have their very impressive biographies, so we want to get right into this. Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you. The first stretch of property that we'll look at belongs to the president, and this is the Luri Ranch. It's a rural stretch of savanna and woodland about 10 miles west of Juba, and it would have barely registered a blip on the radar 10 years ago. 5 years later, it is increasingly a nucleus of power for the country's president. The developments at and around President Kiir's ranch in Luri provide a snapshot of how he has governed by cultivating relationships with private companies and foreign investors. In this case, a firm owned by a prominent businessman close to Kiir's family, spending tens of millions of dollars of state money on lethal military hardware, including attack helicopters that have been used against South Sudanese civilians, recruiting, training, and unleashing a private militia on civilians and rival factions within the military, and simultaneously amassing a fortune. Construction on the compound began in late 2013 and continued for more than 2 years, appearing to conclude in early 2016. This period corresponds almost exactly with the dates of the current civil war and the acute fiscal crisis and economic implosion that South Sudan has experienced in its wake. The Luri property is not the Kiir family's only home away from home. Several members of the Kiir family live in an elegant two-story villa in a gated community within Lavington, one of the nicest neighborhoods in Nairobi. The villa has several balconies that appears to be well over 5,000 square feet. The front courtyard and expansive backyard are large and well-maintained. Comparable homes in this neighborhood sell for about $1 million. Until early 2013, we're now looking at the vice president, Riek Machar. Some of Machar's family lived in an elegant villa in a gated community within a neighborhood called Runda on the outskirts of Nairobi. The residence has 6 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, high-end fixtures, 2 large balconies, a large and well-manicured front yard, and is surrounded by a tall fence. Although their stay at Runda ended, the Machar family appears to maintain a residence in another upscale neighborhood in Nairobi. Members of Machar's family who social media postings and eyewitness accounts indicate were living in the villa in Runda, posted photos on social media claiming that they had moved into a home in Lavington, the same part of the city where the Kir family lives. We're now looking at the Chief of Defense Staff. In Nairobi, Malong's family owns a villa in an upscale gated community within Nyari Estate. The home includes marble floors throughout, a grand staircase, numerous balconies, a guest house, an expansive driveway, and a large in-ground pool. Based on a review of comparable prices in the area, the house is worth approximately $2 million. General Malong's salary is about $45,000 per year. Yet Malong has two large and luxurious homes in Uganda. One of these homes sits inside a wall compound located just off Kawaku-Bwerenga Road, halfway between Kampala and Entebbe. Built in 2012, this two-story home is a massive rose-colored mansion with dozens of large ornate windows and appears to be well over 7,000 square feet. His second home in Uganda is a Mediterranean-style villa constructed in 2013 and early 2014. It is located just off Nanjara Road in Bungu, an upscale neighborhood in southern Kampala. Sitting inside a wall compound at the end of a cobblestone street, the pale yellow two-story home appears to be well over 6,000 square feet, with large pillars lining the entrance and at least 3 balconies. His next-door neighbor is General Gabriel Jock Riak, who has been a subject of a UN-mandated travel ban and asset freeze since last July. Paul Malong's predecessor is General James Hoth Mai. He has not been involved in the violence that is currently gripping South Sudan. Instead, he has been residing in a $1.3 million mansion in Australia. The home is described by the realty company that sold it as perfecting the balance between serenity and glamour. The home boasts 4 bedrooms, a top-of-the-line kitchen, a 2-tiered home theater, a sauna, an infinity pool. Being the country's top general shouldn't be the surest way to wealth. Thank you.
So how does one afford to live in a multi-million-dollar mansion on a salary of $40,000 or $60,000 a year? The registration filings for a company called Combined Holding Limited provide one clue. A 25% shareholder in this company is someone with the surname Kir Mayardit. The filings are accompanied by a copy of this person's passport. Now, we're not going to show the face of the person who owns this 25% stake because it's a 12-year-old child. However, as the passport indicates, this is the 12-year-old son of the president. He lists son of the president as his occupation. He's not alone. This appears to be a pretty popular line of work for the president's sons. 3 other company filings we found also list President Kir's children as son of president for their occupation. Now, not only is this a popular occupation amongst President Kir's children, but it appears to be quite a lucrative one as well. We found that at least 7 of President Kir's children hold stakes in companies across a wide range of business sectors in South Sudan. We're talking about oil companies, mining companies, banks, telecommunications, gambling. Virtually every profitable economic sector in South Sudan, President Kir's family has an interest. We found documents that show that teenage children and adolescent children of the president have held stakes in holding companies and banks. President Kir's wife is also active in the business world. She holds a 50% stake in a prominent telecom company called Gemtel that used to be owned by the investment arm of President Muammar Gaddafi's government from Libya. The other 50% is held by her son. She also has a stake in a construction company. Her brother, Major General Gregory Vasily, he's responsible for commanding forces that protect an oil field in Poloch. He's very close to the First Lady and the President. And we found documents signed by Major General Gregory Vasily for a company in which he holds a substantial stake, receiving contracts from the military in which he serves as a senior officer. In addition, we know that Major General Gregory Vasily's company has been involved in a joint venture with Petronas, the big multinational Malaysian oil company that's operating in South Sudan. We also found that Major General Vasily's company purchased an entire Petronas subsidiary for the price of 25,000 euros. I don't know about you, I've never seen an operating oil company sell for that low of a price before. You know, it's not just the Kier family. The Malong family also, we've seen them involved in a wide range of business sectors. The few other generals that we're profiling today. I've never seen anything so brazen in my time as an investigator. At one point, I contacted a son of President Paul Malong who's involved in a few mining companies to get comment from him based on our findings. I identified who I was and I let him know what we were looking for. And without missing a beat, he began pitching me on an investment. He said, when we do mining, it will involve my father and the president, and we don't have to go through a public tender process. It's as if no one was ever going to look. And if they were going to look, there weren't going to be any consequences. And there's also an indication that some of these top officials, they're involved, and they may be the ones actually behind the companies in which their children are involved in. For example, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the military, Paul Malong's deputy, he's in charge of arms procurement. We found a company called All Energy Limited, in which he has held a substantial 40% stake. The rest of the shares are held by members of his family. Next to all of their names on the corporate registration documents is his signature.
So I'm going to talk about banks and what we found during our investigations is that the conduct that's being perpetrated by the South Sudanese officials could not be done without the assistance of the enablers and the facilitators. Like George and Don stated, it's the bankers, it's the real estate agents, it's lawyers. The evidence that we collected shows that foreign companies who are currently doing business in South Sudan made payments directly into the bank accounts of top generals. Unlike Paul Malong, his salary is approximately $45,000 a year as chief of staff. His other generals earn about $35,000 a year. Well, my review and our review of these bank accounts showed that over $3 million transferred through General Malik Rumad Riak's bank account in a 3-year period. An analysis of those records indicate that $700,000 in cash deposits from undetermined sources went into this account. There were numerous large, even dollar money transfers into this account from Turkish, Lebanese, and Chinese construction companies, all of whom are currently doing business in South Sudan. Our investigation also shed light on another general, General Gabriel Jacques Riak. You saw his house in one of the previous videos. It was the house next door to General Paul Malong. Again, on a salary of approximately $35,000 a year, he has this house. We were able to determine that in 2014, Dalbert Petroleum, an oil company doing business in South Sudan, was awarded contracts to deliver fuel to the Army, the SPLA, in an area that was experiencing very heavy conflict. Dalbert Petroleum refused to deliver to that location because of the danger involved and was told to refund the money back. So instead of refunding the money back into the coffers of the government of South Sudan, they were instructed to wire that same money into the personal accounts of 3 individuals. And one of those transfers was a $309,524 transfer into the personal bank account of General Gabriel Jacques Riak at a Kenyan bank, and it was a US dollar account. Further investigation showed that those funds were part of the money that bought the house in Uganda. This is the same general that was mentioned a moment ago. He was sanctioned by the UN Security Council in July of 2015. That sanction basically should have seized his assets and prohibited his movement or travel outside of South Sudan. But the reality is he's purchased this residence, and a review of bank records indicate that he was still conducting transactions out of in US dollars out of a Kenyan bank up to up until the fall of 2015. So the sanctions didn't prohibit his movement and didn't freeze his assets. At the end of the day, to purchase that house, you needed a lawyer, you needed a real estate agent. To move those monies, to open these accounts, they're in their names, they're not hiding. I mean, the money went into the account of Malik Reuben Riak. The money went into the account of General Gabriel Jacques Riak. So there are bankers involved, there are lawyers involved, there are arms brokers, there are companies paying what appear to be possible bribes or kickbacks. And at the end of the day, $4 billion has left South Sudan over the last few years. And ultimately, the bankers have not only the ability, but the responsibility to do something, to act. And the lack of that action, without taking action, the people of South Sudan are the ones who are suffering the consequence.
Thanks, Deb. And just a quick footnote for those that didn't have the bios. Deb was an investigator for the FBI, anti-corruption investigator for the FBI for many, many years. JR was an investigator for the Defense Department for many years, and Brian was an investigative journalist. Before we move to questions, and we're coming very soon, we want to bring you some good news. The U.S. government and other governments around the world have the tools to change the equation in South Sudan. The Sentry has the evidence that's needed to begin using these policy tools in South Sudan and using them effectively.
We've created dossiers that we are turning over to the United States and other governments that can take action. We're removing one major obstacle to action: the lack of actionable information and intelligence on the money flows associated with those responsible for war and atrocities.
And we're also providing some of this evidence directly to major banks. They do have the leverage to stop this money from moving through the U.S. and international financial systems.
Because it bears repeating, we're proposing a totally unique policy approach for preventing atrocities and promoting peace. And this model could go far beyond South Sudan. We're proposing to combine anti-money laundering measures with targeted sanctions focused on the top leaders, accompanied by robust enforcement. And that's the message that Don and George and I are going to bring to President Obama today. Our aim isn't just to freeze a few assets, like some of those that you saw on the screen today. It's to freeze those responsible for mass atrocities out of the formal international financial system. We're not trying to change the government in South Sudan. We're trying to support the vast majority of South Sudanese people who want to see the entire system reformed and who are working for peace and for human rights and for good governance in their country, so that their voices can count and that all the opportunities and the resources of the country don't end up in the hands of a few officials and their families.
The ongoing Sentry investigations will feed right into that enforcement effort, and this is just the first step. We'll continue to dig and find more. But with the crisis mounting for the people of South Sudan, this could no longer wait.
Right. Like Don said, this isn't the end of the investigation. This is just the very beginning. And we encourage anyone with any evidence pertaining to this investigation to contact us on our website, that particularly people of South Sudan. But for now, these are our findings. What you do with this information will matter. We have the moral obligation and the ability to act. We cannot continue to look away. History is watching.
Now we're going to open up to questions. And joining us on the panel is Brad Brooks Rubin, who is the policy director at the Sentry. And he has a former Treasury Department and State Department official. Now, Alexis Weiss from Edelman is going to facilitate this discussion. So point your questions at her and she'll help us.
Great. If you could just raise your hand, wait for the mic to come to you, and identify your name and the outlet that you're with, that would be great. Let's go with the lady right in the front. Thank you. Is this on?
I'm Suzanne Kianpour with the BBC. Mr. Clooney, why is this so important? Do you think it's really going to make a difference? And what's next? And also, do you think your optimism in South Sudan and its leaders was misplaced at the time of independence?
Well, I'll start with the last question first. We had optimism in hopes that the country of South Sudan would do well. We also were very realistic about it from the very beginning. The reality was, if South Sudan wasn't allowed to vote for their own independence, there was going to be a war. That's by every expert's analysis. So the first thing that was important was that we all, and that includes the Security Council and many, many governments, supported the ability for them to vote for their independence. We always knew that there would be a difficult road ahead. Do we think this will make a difference? We do, because this is pretty explosive stuff. We're talking about the president and the ousted vice president, along with all their generals, that we're able to prove without any question that not only are they committing these crimes, which they've already been accused of, but that they're profiting off of it. You know, the idea is, and what's important to understand about how this works is that whoever has the power, whoever has the is in power in government, has the purse strings and is able to then purchase weapons and use those. So everyone is fighting for power. This is why the money part is important. Mashar now is out. So at one point, Mashar made a deal with a Russian arms dealer who used the name, what was his name?
Magomed Erzunukayev.
But what's his name now?
His new name is Mark Goldman.
Mark Goldman. Hi, I'm Mark Goldman. You know, nice to meet you. So he made a deal selling the futures of oil to get arms, because he's actually selling off something that has yet to happen to try to get arms, to try to get back in power, to have the purse strings to continue to be back in power. This is a vicious circle that's going on. Will it work? You know, our hope is that with the help of the government and with the help of the banks, you know, we're not finished with this. There's a lot to be said and a lot more further investigation. Stay tuned to come where we're actually talking to the banks, because the banks have a responsibility. It's very easy to say, well, we didn't know. We didn't know we were doing business with people who were committing war crimes, and we didn't know that we were helping to fund atrocities. Well, we're going to let them know, and then we're going to see what their reaction is to that.
The lady in the second row.
Thank you. Leslie Rawton from Reuters. Do you think the international community has some responsibility to bear for this? These aren't new allegations. They've been going on for more than 5 years, or probably further than that, since I can remember, covering this war. So do you think the international community has some responsibility to bear on this? And number two, what do you expect from the region, such as, you know, countries such as Kenya? I was just with John Kerry in Nairobi trying to deal with this issue, and he said it was up to the region and to South Sudan's leaders to try to deal with ensuring that the country didn't slide back to war. So what do you expect from the region itself on this issue?
John, you want to take it?
Well, on the first question, and I think maybe a couple of people on the panel might have some comments on these excellent questions. The first one on the international community's responsibility. Certainly, there's a lot of credit that should be given across administrations, from the Bush administration's pursuit of peace during the horrible North-South war that went on for 25 years and took 2.25 million lives. Let's not forget out of what hell South Sudan was born. And it was a rocky birth, and everyone predicted it would be very, very difficult, and it has been perhaps even worse. Now, the fatal flaw in the international strategy has been that there was not a sufficient focus on the core rot at the foundation of this new government, that the vast preponderance of the resources were being stolen right out from the Treasury. All of the oil money was being taken, and the rest was being used to finance arms acquisitions. And when you don't address that core problem at the root of the crisis, but you continue to provide resources and assistance to the country, you're throwing good money after bad. And I think that's been the lesson. We're learning that lesson, by the way, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places where much more money that has been spent on South Sudan has been thrown into these places in state-building exercises without dealing with the core kleptocracy, the core mass corruption. In a kleptocracy, corruption isn't an aberration, it is the system. That is how governance has been hijacked and repurposed to enrich the top leaders, and they compete and fight for that. If you don't address that core, you're going to get a continuation of the crisis. Brian, do you want to talk about the regional dimension?
The region can do a lot to help cut off the financial flows from South Sudan by enhancing their banking regulations. But they do have an obligation. They have signed on to the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, and under that convention, they do have an obligation to act.
Man with the tie, red and blue, right there.
Man with a tie.
That narrows it down.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm PJ Tobier from the PBS NewsHour. This report doesn't talk about an arms embargo, and in the last few days, the UN Security Council has put that on the table, a possible arms embargo to South Sudan. The U.S. government's been on board with that. And while they're at it, why not a mineral embargo? South Sudan is very mineral rich. It's got big customers for those minerals in China. What about that as a strategy?
Anybody want to say?
I'll
be glad to, but
yeah, go ahead.
let me start and then we'll continue. But the arms embargo we strongly support.
Yeah, big time.
And we know that, in fact, if an arms embargo was imposed, there'd be a chance to remove some of the foreign crews that have been flying these attack helicopters, which has been one of the most damaging parts of the war. There are a number of easier to identify arms transactions that could be potentially countered. So an arms embargo is not a panacea, but it is certainly one piece of an overall strategy that can reduce the resources for killing and destruction in South Sudan. A mineral embargo is a little more complicated because the natural resources buried in the soil of South Sudan are the curse in some ways of its present, but the hope for its future.
The lifeblood for the people.
The lifeblood for the people, as Don said. And so creating incentives for positively developing the mineral sector, oil and gold and other minerals that are plentiful in South Sudan, is the direction that we are going to be encouraging and proposing. So there's always incentives that are positive and negative. Right now, all the incentives in South Sudan are to steal everything you can and violently extract the resources. There is no accountability. We'd like to create accountability and consequences so that the incentive structure shifts, so that the development of the mineral sector, which is the future of the country, can be done in a way that positively benefits the people of South Sudan.
Thank you. John, my name's Ayan Bior from Voice of America. And John, this question is for you. You mentioned that the Sentry has a new approach to stopping corruption, and you will use new anti-money laundering techniques to do this. Could you expand on that? What exactly does that mean? And then also, the second question, Jacques Riac is on the report, and he is UN sanctioned. But I'm wondering what that means for UN sanctions, since he does appear on this report and has also moved hundreds of thousands of dollars, as the report says. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. I'll take the first one, and JR, do you want to, and Deb perhaps on General Jacques Riac. The question is, what is this new approach that we're pursuing? And we spent a lot of time talking to experts who know a lot about international financial and money movement, and about the effective ways in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the United States Treasury Department and finance ministries around the world worked together to begin to attempt to shut international terrorists and terrorist organizations out of the formal financial system. There were lessons that began to dawn on us and said, well, this approach that was then used to isolate the Iranian regime in order to drive it to the table for the nuclear deal Same approach that's being used to counter and halt some of the major international criminal organizations and their attempts to move money. We thought, well, why can't that first team of international policy responses that's so effective in so many other places, why can't we use that to prevent genocide and other mass atrocities in Africa? Why should there be a two-tier system of international responses? Why can't we utilize those same policy tools? And so we began to study them and consult experts about how they worked and what didn't work in some places. And so our conclusion is this, is that when you combine, the cocktail that is most effective is the combination of anti-money laundering measures, which we spell out very specifically in the report, because there are a lot of them. There are specific AML measures, anti-money laundering measures, that can be deployed for almost no cost in the service of peace and human rights and preventing atrocities in South Sudan, combined with a more effective and smarter use of targeted sanctions. We often sanction people in a war, and people refer to them in Africa as sanctioning by press release, because there's no follow-up, there's no enforcement. And what we're talking about is these anti-money laundering measures, and our work at the Sentry, we're going to follow up on these designations for the sanctions list, and we'd like to see it expanded to the networks that have hijacked the economy of South Sudan and their international facilitators. You want to change people's calculations about whether or not they're going to commit atrocities, you go after their wallets. That's the new approach. Now, for the General Jokriak question, Debra, JR, you guys.
Yeah. Well, I can touch on it. The U.S. and our international partners have the ability to seize and restrain bank accounts around the world. These particular accounts that I mentioned, both Malik Rubin Riaks and Gabriel Jack Riaks, both of those accounts were U.S. dollar-based accounts, which means every time money was wired into those accounts or large wire transfers were sent out of those accounts, they should have circumvented through the United States financial system. That means there are records of those transactions in the United States, the Federal Reserve, the correspondent banking network, as well as what Brian was saying. Uganda and Kenya are both members of UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption. They have the tools to seize, restrain, and recover assets and hopefully repatriate them to the people of South Sudan in such a way that there is a true benefit of repatriating that money, that the people of South Sudan see that the money was returned and that they reap the benefits of what it should have been used for in the first place.
In the front row, right here.
David Smith of The Guardian. You talk about asset freezes and financial measures, but looking at the example of President Bashir, the president of Sudan and other examples around the world, do you really think that ever can be enough? Will South Sudan's leaders not simply dig in their heels further? Does there not actually have to be, realistically, regime change, however that comes about? And a second question about the role of the US government. You mentioned you're going to take these findings to President Obama, but realistically, he's only got a few months left in office. What, if anything, do you think would be done about the situation by either a President Trump or a President Clinton? And on that point, could you just talk about Secretary of State Clinton's role in the birth of South Sudan? Were mistakes made? Is that a good or a bad omen for taking the situation forward now?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the first question, which was about Omar al-Bashir, and the reality is, the reason that we had such success with sanctions in Iran and were able to bring them to the table was because not only did you say, okay, well, we're going to freeze these, we're going to follow up. Basically, what would happen is a company would start up. You'd say, well, you're not allowed to do business with that company. The company would change their name. It would all be the exact same people. And we had the assets, we had the money to follow those people and say, nope, that's the same company. Follow them again, shut them down. No, and they would continually change, continually do that. There hasn't been that kind of allocation of money to this situation for many reasons. One is there's a lot of things going on in the world that that seem a lot more important, that seem a lot more dangerous. There's ISIS, there's North Korea. You go down the list of the things that where the State Department and the international community have their focus. The reality is we want that same sort of laser-like focus that was used in Iran in particular to be able to say, okay, now, South Sudan, every time you change, and had we been able to do that with Bashir, we would have had much more success, I believe. That I think is sort of the point of all of this. I would also say that, when we started the Sentry, originally, John and Don and I were working on a thing called the Satellite Sentinel, which was going after Bashir, which was a satellite following them around. It was successful for a period of time because we got pictures of mass graves and troop buildups and all kinds of things that were really successful. But after a while, nobody did anything, right? So you can be on the front of the Guardian, for instance, with a photo and a story, but if nobody does anything, eventually they go, well, if you're not going to do anything, we're going to continue to act. So it is, so the reason that we changed it up and said, well, then let's start following the money, which is always usually the most effective tool. And that's how the Sentry was born. But it all stems from, we didn't start looking at South Sudan, we started looking at Sudan. So we haven't given up on Sudan, and there's more of that to come. And just talking about Bashir, you want to take the...
Yeah, this is an important question. I want to turn to Brad Brooks-Rubin, our former Treasury Department person, to talk about, well, what can be done in the last few months of the Obama administration?
Thanks, John. Yeah, the Treasury Department, I mean, there may only be a few months, but the actions that we're proposing are actions that can be taken quickly and that remain. The staffs that are in charge, the relationships with banks, those are things that go on. And the reason we are focused on these anti-money laundering measures, advisories, uses of different parts of the Patriot Act, and robust enforcement and building out of the networks that these companies have, that's work that keeps going on into the next administration, but the starting point can happen very quickly. The starting point can happen once these findings are in place and the determinations are made, they're put in place immediately, and that means banks start acting immediately, and that's what's important to happen in these last few months.
Be in the second row.
Hi, Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera English. First question, are you meeting with President Obama today or in the future? And the second question is, you mentioned that you're going to notify these banks, these lawyers, these real estate agents, that they've been doing this business. If they don't stop, are you going to publicly out them?
Yes. I mean, that's the important part of this. You can't shame war criminals. We've learned that over the years. We've learned that, Omar al-Bashir is charged with war crimes. We did the best we could to shame him. We showed pictures of Antonovs dropping bombs. We did everything we could to show that these people were committing crimes. You can't shame them. But you know who you can shame? Banks. You can shame people in the international community that want to continue to do business in the international community. So yes, we are going to name them. We're meeting with President Obama later today. We're meeting with Secretary Kerry. We're meeting
Secretary Lew from
Secretary
Treasury,
Lew
from
the Treasury, and with Susan Rice, all of whom we've had many correspondence over the years on these same issues. So.
And I think the important thing to note about that, as well as what you're saying, is who we're going to put on notice, is that we're careful in this attempt not to suggest that there should be no dealings with South Sudan in any financial way. Right. We want to go after these very targeted assets and be very clear about the actors who are doing the harm in the region, but do it in a way that is precise so as to not scare them away from doing the general business that is necessary for the people of South Sudan. And there's systems in place for that. It's not something that is going to be done ham-handedly. We want this to be very targeted and very specific.
We don't want this to be Somalia. We don't want all the banking to be shut down completely and nobody to be able to do anything. We want, and by the way, we're going to give the banks an opportunity to make it right. We're going to sit down and say, let's assume that you didn't know, and that's a fair assumption because they go through many different shell companies oftentimes, and it's difficult to know. But if we're now giving you the information and you now know, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's a fair question. Well, I don't know. We're still working on that part of it. Right now, we're working. This is the first step. You know, again, what's interesting about this was South Sudan wasn't our initial target. We were going after Bashir. I mean, that was the initial thing, was we were going to say, well, if we can't do it with satellite imagery and with all the other versions of things we've tried, then let's try going after his money, going after their money. What happened along the way was South Sudan started blowing up, and we had to take an honest and hard look at the people who were involved, including people that we know, and we had to say, in fairness, this is what's going on. These are the facts, and present the facts to the public, and hope that that'll help move the needle. I don't know.
Let's see. I mean, he's made a very strong commitment in the course of his administration to preventing atrocities. He personally intervened in the diplomacy to prevent, in our view, a resumption of the North-South War, which again, 2.25 million people died. That's one of the deadliest wars in the world since World War II. No one knows about it. President Obama put his personal diplomacy into the mix in 2010 and helped avert that crisis. He helped the referendum, ensure that the referendum occurred. But as we said, in all fairness, this issue of corruption is the thing that everyone missed or didn't get right fully, including us. And we're working at it, and we're trying to focus on the core driver of the violence today.
Yes, the lady in the front row.
Yes. Yeah, I'm Carolyn Ramsey with the Ramsey Merriam Fund, and we fund the Sentry project. I'm very curious to know whether Obama can take one of his famous executive actions, since he can't get anything done with Congress, and also what's happened about the International Criminal Court. Have they taken action on this?
Well, I'm going to say something, and then you come, Brad. Thank you very much. As Brad said, the administration, President Obama can take action very quickly in some of these financial measures. We're proposing, or we're going to talk to him this afternoon about an executive order that would, a new executive order for South Sudan that would allow acts of mass corruption, like we've documented, and as well as the war crimes that are being committed in South Sudan, to be the predicate offenses for which sanctions can be targeted and imposed on particular leaders. And we're also going to encourage him and Secretary Liu from the Treasury Department to use the existing anti-money laundering authorities in unique and new ways. And we'll discuss in detail with him and with the Treasury Secretary and with National Security Advisor Rice and Secretary Kerry about how they can actually do this. Because we're proposing some new things, some things they've never done before with the Patriot Act and Section 311. So that's the kind of stuff, and I think at the end of the day, in all of our meetings, the three of us that we've had with President Obama, he's been very, very receptive and has often worked very assiduously on these issues. So I think we're all confident that some action will happen.
Also, you have to remember, because this is a political season, right? And so everything gets sort of boiled down into politics and who failed and who didn't. And the reality is, this is not a partisan issue. In fact, I sat here at this very table with Sam Brown back when we were talking about Darfur, and you could argue that our politics don't necessarily line up. The Republicans, Democrats, the right, left, the Christian right, students, this is something that is fairly universally supported. So we don't expect to have a whole lot of pushback as it being sort of, well, the Senate won't do it or the Congress won't do it because it's politicized, because this is an issue that, although it's a political season, could move forward. So,
anything you want to add, Brad? Or you good? Okay.
Second row, right here.
Thank you so much. Raquel Sanz from TV3 Barcelona, Spain, public television. I was wondering, you didn't name any banks yet. You're working on that. But you talked about some countries, Lebanese, Chinese, and Turkish construction companies dealing with South Sudan. I was wondering if you could name some countries which are more to blame about what's happening in South Sudan, about the links with what's going on.
Go to it, JR.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that really struck us throughout the course of the investigation was the diversity of international companies and banks that were actually involved in a lot of these transactions. So the striking thing is that, you know, everybody's in on it. And I would say, you know, there's a particular bank we talk about in the report called Kenya Commercial Bank that we think processed a lot of these problematic transactions. There are construction companies from Turkey. There are, you know, mining companies from Kenya. There are Chinese investors doing joint ventures in the gambling sector and the private security sector with the president's in-laws. You know, there's plenty of blame to go around here. This system is rotten to its core, and there's no one government that's going to be able to just completely shut down. I think we really need some sort of collaborative effort. Well, we know that Mark Goldman, the arms trafficker we were discussing earlier, he's based in Geneva. He is working with, or he was working with a Ukrainian defense firm and in negotiations to sell weapons to Riek Machar's side in return for oil. We also know that there was another Ukrainian firm that is maintaining and was providing support for the attack helicopters used by President Kiir. So one thing that we know is this isn't necessarily geopolitically motivated all the time. So these guys are profit motivated.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. Let's go with this gentleman right here.
Hey y'all, I'm Daniel White from Time Magazine. I wanted to switch gears and ask you guys about social media. So what role did social media play in the investigation? What outlets was it? So was it Facebook? I saw a few Instagram posts. And was this like the icing on the cake, or did this point out red flags? Would you guys have figured out that the Machars had moved without social media?
Well, the investigators that we have here and also the ones actually in country are, I think, doing the bulk of the investigation. The social media postings just proved that the hubris and the proof when they're posing with stacks of dollars and like rappers, that this is where the money is flowing, and that they clearly have no concern over being caught or in any way being censored as a result.
Do you want to add anything, JR?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, a really diverse spectrum of social media outlets that we saw information posted on. In some cases, we would be able to, you know, have to confirm that certain people lived within a house that we already suspected because they post a bunch of pictures next to a really beautiful pool. But yeah, I would just echo what Don said. Are the accounts still active? For the most part, yeah, they're active in public. Anyone in this room could see them.
At 11:01, I don't know if they will be.
Yeah, that might all change. Also, you know, you have to understand that it's, you know, on top of that, we have a bunch of investigators who were on the ground doing it. Many of them we're not bringing up here because it would put them at risk, quite honestly. Some of them are here, and they've been in a lot of different countries, and, you know, taken pictures with selfie sticks and done all kinds of things to get to get this information. So it's been a long 2-year investigation. We wouldn't be coming here unless we thought we'd actually finally cracked it. And what we think that's most important about this is that we're talking about the president and the ousted vice president, who are both at war, who are profiting off of the atrocities of their own citizenry, and we think that it's pretty damning evidence, and that's why we thought we'd bring it to you.
And I would like to just say one more thing, is that often, as we had spoken about this before, where we started with Darfur and we started with the genocide there, that there is a lot of international goodwill, yet there often seems to not be enough political, I guess, the will to act in that way. And a lot of that is a result of the light being off of the issue. So you guys play a huge role in this, and we hope that you will look into this. We hope that you will report about it. We know that everything is crowding for space with the election now, but we hope that this is something that can take precedent, in some of your papers and your periodicals, and you can push this forward as well.
And to finish up with what Don said, investigate this. Investigate us. We feel very confident with this information, but don't take our word for it. Take the information that we're giving you and investigate it yourselves, because our job is to present facts and hope that and know that they'll hold up. But we absolutely welcome, and that's not for necessarily all the people in this room, but that's for the people who are watching in South Sudan who either are supportive of Machar or supportive of the Kiir government and think somehow this is one-sided in one way or the other. Please look at the dossier, look at the information. We'll have it online for you. And please investigate and look at it with an open mind.
That concludes the Q&A. Thank you so much for coming today.